Welcome to the 2023 Spring Great Debate Panel on our current inflation crisis and the possibility of a national and, of course, for me, a global recession, because I'm very interested in that aspect of things. As you guys, most of you know, I am your political science coordinator, co-moderator, just a professor generally speaking, Dr. Emily Stacy. I am thrilled beyond words to be here. As usual, I get to wake up and they pay me to host these kinds of events and hopefully bring you guys some in-depth education and knowledge that you may be missing other places. So I'm just so blessed to have this position. And as I mentioned, my fantastic partner in crime, Associate Dean James Davenport, kindly agreed, even though he's very busy, to co-host this debate panel with me because I do not focus on the political economy. And as a card-carrying libertarian, I think it's one of his burning missions in life.
She just outed me. She just outed me.
I outed you way before that.
I don't think it was much of a secret. But
way before that. So I appreciate you being here with me today, James Davenport. It's one of the only things we've been able to get together and do this semester, so I'm always very appreciative to have my partner in crime. So we're thrilled, like I said, to have all of you here today, my faculty members or colleagues, my division leadership, Dean Tony Castillo. We're all so thrilled to have your support and to be able to pretty much dream up any event we want and be able to put it on. I am so lucky. So before I introduce our panelists, I just want to shout out a couple of folks. John Shackelford at the back, our camera dude, our technician. He is fantastic, and he's part of Connie Myrick's team on event services, so we really appreciate them, as well as Dr. Anita Poole-Ensley. As I mentioned, my awesome division leadership and the executive team members who are here, Adam Bush, always interested in economic issues. Thank you guys, really, for being here today for this incredible conversation, and I will let James introduce our panelists.
all right. Our panel's credentials are quite impressive. I'm a little intimidated just standing up here next with all of them. But we're very lucky to have such a knowledgeable group on our campus to discuss where we are today in terms of our economic environment and perhaps what the future may hold. With that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our panelists very briefly, and then we'll get the conversation started. So, at the far end of to my right is Courtney Crowley. She is a senior economist with the Regional Affairs Department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. She also serves as special advisor on the agricultural economy to the Federal Reserve Governor, Mickey Bowman. Courtney's current research focuses on agricultural finance, commodity markets, farm management, and natural resource economics and policy. Her responsibilities also include writing for the 10th District Survey of Agricultural Credit Conditions and agricultural finance updates. Courtney joined the bank in 2015 after completing her PhD in agricultural economics at Oklahoma State University. She holds a BS in biosystems engineering, all right?
That's right.
I'm even more intimidated
Yeah.
from Oklahoma State, and an MS in civil engineering from Colorado State University.
Fabulous.
So thank you for being with us.
Yes,
here
thank
today.
you. So on my far end is Dr. Travis Roche, so Associate Professor and Chairperson of the Department of Economics and an MBA faculty member. He is also the founding director of the Fiscal Policy Institute, an interdisciplinary research center housed in the College of Business at UCO. I'm sorry, I should have said that before. Sorry. So Roche originally hails from Austin, Texas, and made his way to Oklahoma by way of Lubbock, Texas, where he completed his doctorate in economics. After completing his doctorate, Roche served as a postdoctorate fellow at the National Wind Institute, where he taught courses on wind energy economy, policy, and law. So prior to living on the windy plains of West Texas, he attended the University of North Texas, where he received a BA in music and a BS in economics. So our humanities faculty may get after him as well later. His research interests are in the fields of economic policy, environmental economics, labor economics, and industrial organization. His research has focused on carbon dioxide emissions from energy use, alternative energy sources, including wind and biofuels, and the unintended consequences of energy production and consumption. Pretty fantastic, dude. Thank you for being here, my friend. To his right is Dr. Britt Norwood, who is currently an assistant professor of economics at OU, where he received his PhD in economics in 2020 and was a visiting professor at professor at where?
Oklahoma State.
Oh, my email just completely cut that off. I apologize. OSU, before returning to OU as a teaching specialist. His fields of interest are education, housing, public policy, and marijuana legislation. So we may pick his brain about other things that happened earlier this year. So most of his work investigates questions relating to education policies and student outcomes, housing markets, and public policies that help low and middle income individuals.
And then, right in the middle, almost, is Dr. Kenneth Kickham.
You know his name.
I'm having trouble this morning. Born in Illinois during the Kennedy administration, Dr. Kenneth Kickham holds BS in accounting from OSU, an MPA from OU, and a PhD in political science from OU. He also holds a master's in adult education from the University of Central Oklahoma. For several years, he was employed at the Department of Human Services, Oklahoma's largest agency in terms of personnel. As an agency comptroller, Dr. Kickham exercised budget responsibility for over $350 million. His research is published in public administration, political science, business, and anthropology journals, and he is former president of the National Association for Welfare Research and Statistics. Welcome, Dr. Kickham.
And I might mention, Dr. Kickham actually had the pleasure of living through me as a student, so he should get double applause because, man, takes a lot. All right, Professor Davenport, Associate Dean Davenport, you have the first question.
All right, we're going to kick this off with, since we're talking about inflation and ostensibly monetary policy, with a question leading off with the great Milton Friedman. Depending on your perspective, maybe he's not so great. But Milton Friedman defined inflation as purely a monetary phenomenon. In other words, too much cash chasing too few goods and services. Do you think that is still an adequate definition of inflation, or would there be a different way you would explain that? If your answer is no, how would your explanation differ from Friedman's? If yes, then how do we distinguish between price increases due to actual inflation from price increases due to other factors such as relative scarcity and such? So we'll kick that off. Who wants to jump in?
It'd be rude to make our Federal Reserve person go first, right? I know all the stipulations that go with that. I suppose I'll jump in there. So I love this quote by Dr. Friedman, and I think it's true some of the times. The answer in economics almost always is it depends.
Yeah.
So in a world in which we're, like, let's say we're in an equilibrium, we're in a good place, if we are pumping dollars into our economy, if we're overspending, then yes, that is true. That's kind of your classic Venezuelan, Zimbabwe experience. I actually, one time I got a gift from a student who went and did a study abroad in Africa. She goes, "Hey, I brought you $1 billion. That's cute. No, she literally brought me $1 billion because their old currency had devalued so greatly that the government kept just adding zeros to the end of that. Now, in that case, yes, that was too many dollars chasing too few goods. And so it has this effect. I almost wish we had two different words for inflation, because what we've seen recently, I think, is a combination of more money in the system, but also historic, unprecedented crisis we had. The Suez Canal get blocked. We had entire economy shut down. We had China implement the zero COVID policy, which effectively shut down entire supply chains. And so we have shortages, which, as an econ professor, I have to think, okay, well, supply shock, that makes prices go up. That is not the type of inflation that Dr. Friedman is talking about there. So I guess the short answer is it depends.
Spoken like a true economist.
Yeah. No, yeah, I would piggyback off that. I agree. Like typically you have like demand pull and cost push inflation. And so what Milton Friedman's talking about is demand pull. As the demand goes up, more money chasing fewer goods. And as you pointed out, the supply chain stuff, that's cost push inflation. So the cost of goods goes up, pushes the price up. The Suez Canal, all the tankers off of California, I think that at one point they had 150 something, they were sitting there for weeks on weeks, and they didn't have the manpower to get them off. The microchip shortage pushing up the price of new cars, which pushed up the price of used cars, as it was a trickle-down effect. So yeah, you have like two types. So yes, he is right when it says like, more money chasing fewer goods, but especially with the pandemic, like we saw, it was more of like a combination of, we had a cost push and demand pull, and it was varying, and it was an unprecedented time. We've never seen this in the last, 50 or 60 years of our economy. So it was kind of like, there's no one cause. It was more like you got this and this and this, and then this fixes, but then this doesn't fix. So it was a bunch of varying domino effects between, the demand side and the supply side. So.
Yeah, I guess over the long term, inflation really isn't viewed as much of a problem from my perspective. It's from a developmental perspective, it's just something we expect as societies grow and develop. More people, more education, more technology, more innovation. In some ways, inflation is like a calendar. What year is it? Well, that's how much a loaf of bread costs. Or the other way around, how much does a loaf of bread cost? Well, that must be what year you're talking about. So it's not really that big of a deal. In that way, I would agree with Friedman over the long term. But in the short term, it can create problems for one party or another. If prices are rising faster than wages, it creates problems for wage earners. If wages are rising, but prices aren't rising because of things that were mentioned before, supply chain issues, that creates problems for other people. So short term, it can be a problem depending on who you are. Long term, it's kind of like the modern monetary theory folks take sort of a benign view of deficits. I mean, it's pretty easy to take long term a benign view of inflation.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said, and I think that when I saw this, my first reaction was, yes, I do agree with this, but I think from a Fed perspective, what we really care about is understanding what's the cause of, the too much cash, which is the demand side, and then why are there too few goods and services? What are those causes? And I think those were touched on. You can have significant supply side shocks. From my perspective as an agricultural economist, the shocks I've been studying have been COVID, which a big reason for a lot of the issues we've seen in terms of, like, if those of you that pay attention at the grocery store to how much you've been spending, and that's been going up and up and up, a lot of that has been because of supply shocks in the food supply chain that have kept occurring. The first one was COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war, and we just keep kind of having these supply shocks pile on and on and on. And then the latest thing has been really significant labor tightness. So not enough workers to, put out the supply that's being demanded from consumers. And so I think that's the only thing that I would add to that, is just that, sometimes it's not enough to define the problem and what it is. It's then, digging into it a little deeper and saying, okay, why are these things occurring? And then what tools do we have to address that? And I think that we'll be covering that in another question.
Fabulous.
Can I follow
Please,
up with
of
just one
course.
thing
This is why
on
he's here.
something that Dr. Kickham said regarding kind of the long term looking at this? Do we expect some measure of inflation, and is some measure of inflation actually a sign of a healthy economy? So I want to throw that out there. Anybody who wants to take that can run with it. But.
Yeah, I think officially we expect something like 2 to 3% as healthy. As you get closer to 0% inflation, then the other problem starts to become a threat. Deflation, recession. Oh.
Yeah, they always kind of equate like 0% inflation like stagnant water. Like I grew up in the South, so if you saw a stagnant pond, it was full of mosquitoes, so it could go either way. So 0 is kind of like it could go really south quick, really north quick. So 2 to 3 is like their golden standard. But I'd also like to point out, like the inflation we're seeing now, especially with goods in the grocery markets, actually affects lower income people more than middle and higher income, because a bigger part of their budget goes to housing and food. So I was joking with my son the other day. I was like, it's Easter and eggs are expensive, so we're going to dye rocks this year. And he was just all like, really? That's so cool. And I was like, well, you just totally missed the econ joke. So, but yeah, no, it is, the disproportionate effects of inflation, especially when you see higher rates, whether it be from the demand side or the supply side. It generally affects lower income people on welfare or SNAP, because their budgets usually are more attributed to housing, energy, and food. And that's what we've seen lately. So,
yeah. And one thing that determines whether or not inflation is long or short term is actually consumer inflation expectations.
yeah, expectations.
So once consumers, and a lot of times those really salient goods like food and gasoline can be more influential in setting what consumers expect. We've been very lucky this time around that consumers have their inflation expectations have been, you'll hear policymakers say they're well anchored, which means that inflation expectations have not risen significantly. They have not gotten out of control, because once that starts to happen, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy almost in the economy, and you can start to see more like inflation, long-term inflation. But we haven't seen that this time, which is a really good sign so far.
Good. Yep. All right. So the second question, excuse me, since 2020, we've seen a significant increase in inflation. So this piggybacks on everything we just have been saying. What have been the factors driving that increase that we haven't necessarily touched on already? Anybody?
Well, I think there's a housing shortage problem. I think supply chain issues were mentioned. Something that might be involved, at least in theory, is when companies buy back their stock. Also, government activity can contribute to short-term inflation, along with these market forces. Like we say in social science, a lot of factors.
Yes.
I think so. A lot of this inflation got priced in immediately, and oftentimes companies, it's very difficult to raise prices because you have customers who typically come back to the same location. Think about your favorite restaurant. You tend to go there. You tend to get the exact same thing, and when you go and you receive the exact same thing, and suddenly it's $1 or $2 more, you're going to feel differently about that place that you're shopping. And so it's hard for your average company to raise prices. On the one hand, it's literally expensive to them. They have what's called menu costs. They have to print a new menu to pass on these new costs, but they may be facing very real price increases themselves. Like if I'm buying my favorite burger, they may have paid more for both the beef, the tomato, the bread, all parts combined. And so unless they take a loss, they're going to have to take this price increase to me, the customer. So there's this push and pull of whether or not they can or whether or not they want to. How long do they themselves expect inflation to be hitting them? Because if they think it's temporary, well then they'd rather not print off a whole bunch of new menus, piss off all their customers, and lose that customer base. So I've heard it explained kind of like looking for a murder. You need means, motive, and opportunity. And so for a price increase to happen, you have to have the means. The motive always exists. Like if I'm a business, I would love to charge you as much as I possibly can, but that's not there. But the opportunity in this case was kind of weird because we had a circumstance where everyone saw that prices were going up, and we had this big discussion about, okay, well, we have these COVID protocols, we have these cost shocks, and so prices kind of went up everywhere all at once. And so it gave a lot of these companies the opportunity to increase their price where they might have been waiting to increase their price for a while. So maybe they moved up to what was their best price. But here's the issue and why some of this inflation has been probably more persistent. They might have overshot where they needed to be because they knew it would be a while until they could increase their prices again. So there's that issue. But then we have to have a hope for very competitive markets. There's a saying in economics that prices tend to rise like a rocket but fall like feathers. It's easy to pass on cost increases, but you're downward sticky. I wouldn't take a lower paying job because suddenly there's deflation. And so it's hard. We got to hope that the competitive process starts to bring down some of these prices, or that firms are having to start gaining some more customers by lowering their prices a little bit. But again, they can't necessarily do that because then they'd have to change their menu prices. So in some cases, we had this big shock upwards, and that's going to be persistent. But for some of those ones that maybe have a digital menu or better able to change their prices to gain customers, we'll start seeing that. So we should hopefully start seeing some deflation just in the form of firms being more competitive with one another.
Yeah, and I mentioned the labor as an issue, but just wanted to dig into that just a little bit more. So even before the pandemic, at the Federal Reserve, part of my job, I'm in regional affairs. Shout out to my colleague Sarah, who's in our public affairs department. A big part of what Sarah and I do, on my side, it's a lot of data and research, but we work very closely with public affairs to gather information from a lot of different stakeholders. So individuals, business, and all of that information from research and anecdotes we funnel it up to our policymakers who sit on the Federal Open Market Committee and make these monetary policy decisions. Well, one of the things that we were hearing very consistently, even before the pandemic, was this issue of labor tightness. So companies struggling to find workers to fill jobs. And if you look at one of the measures that I think is most important to track right now is a measure that we call V over U. So that's the ratio of vacancies, so job vacancies, to unemployed workers or workers that are unemployed looking for a job. That has been around 2, so 2 vacancies for every unemployed worker. Really in this time period that it's had steadily increased and has been around 2 for a while now. And that's much higher than it was. I think prior to the pandemic, we were around, we were pretty even at 1, like 0.5 to 1, that area. And so what that causes is, a couple of things. One, employers have to pay higher wages. So then workers are able to receive higher wages and have more money. So too much cash. Chasing too few goods, so workers have more money to spend, and then the increased costs, from the employer, they have to pass that on in the form of higher prices. And one example of where we see that is because I study food and agriculture is in food. So in 2021 and 2022, the biggest contributor to higher food prices overall has been in the processed food category. In 2020, it was meats driving everything because the pandemic shut down a lot of our meat processing facilities, and we had huge supply shortages. But then since then, it's been the processed food category. And why is that? Well, processed food requires a lot more labor than a lot of the other unprocessed food that we might think about eating, so like fresh fruits and vegetables, for example. So we've seen really strong impacts from tight labor markets in all of our supply chains contributing to higher prices. And why that's concerning, we talked about long term, we have a lot of labor issues to disentangle to get away from that 2 vacancies to every unemployed worker. Since 2016, we have a deficit of about 2 million immigrants into the country. A lot of people in the pandemic left the labor force from early or unexpected retirements. Some of those have come back, some of them have not. We lost a lot of women in the labor force in the pandemic, and actually prime-age women have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, but we have some really major issues, and that's why a lot of you young people are here. There's a lot of opportunities out there in the labor market now because of that, but I think it might take a long time for us to get back to a more normal level of labor market conditions. So.
Yeah, excuse me. I agree with all of y'all, especially with the menu costs and the labor market. So many of y'all know that during the pandemic, everyone went to a QR code menu, which did reduce the menu cost quite significantly. Because if it's digital, you can just easily digitally do it, and it goes across everything. So that's probably why we see changing prices at restaurants, bars, and whatnot. But prices are sticky, So they're not going to instantly go up or instantly go down, especially if it's wages. Because, like you said before, if you're working and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you know what, we're in a recession, we're going to lower your wage, you're going to be like, well, I'm going to be less productive, or see ya, I'm out the door. But the pandemic has really like thrown everything like from traditional theoretical economics for the last 6 years upside down. I mean, the pandemic with the labor market, single parents, mothers leaving, going in and out, shutting down the entire, leisure and hospitality industry. I mean, from March to May of 2020, we lost more than we did during the Great Recession in GDP standards. So it was a huge, just in 3 months versus 3 years. So it kind of drives home, like with inflation, like it really is a driving factor in expectations, what we think, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And, we're all kind of learning by doing, all of us economists, because, traditional Phillips curve, as unemployment goes up, inflation, goes down, blah, 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 has not been true. So we're kind of on the fly, traditional econ side, when we always end the conversation like, well, it depends. So.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No.
We learn from each recession we go through.
Yeah.
There's an old saying that every happy family is exactly alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in their own unique way. Every recession is unique in its own way. So we learn something kind of bit by bit. So the Great Recession taught us that, we had this 3-year long, big, devastating drop, and it took 7-8 years to even return to pre-recession levels. And at the time, it felt like we had a lot of monetary stimulus, and we had a lot of groups coming out and saying, oh my God, this is going to cause the worst inflation we've ever seen. This is detrimental to society. And you had all these warning signals. We had quantitative easing 2. They started calling it quantitative easing infinity.
Yeah.
But this inflation never showed up. And so what we learned from that period was, okay, we had this big, long, devastating recession. We threw a lot of money at it, what we thought was a lot of money at it at the time, and it still took 7 to 8 years to recover. This last pandemic recession, 3 months, happened right back. And we need to keep in mind that the Fed has a dual mandate. So they are in charge of price stability and maximum employment. Now, they've tended to pay more attention to the price stability side of that. In this case, it looks as if they've paid a little more attention to the maximum employment. And so, yes, we have a vibrant, tight, good labor market right now. We have, so for instance, the employment to population ratio is a good classic example of like good labor market health, how many people there are and how many people are employed. The black employment to population ratio is better now than it was before the pandemic. In what was seen as kind of this Goldilocks economy of things are going well, we've now improved workforce conditions for an entire segment of our population. The unemployment rate for people with a disability is lower now than it ever has been historically. So we have people entering into the job market and the labor force that had been left out prior to this. And so these are things that, it's on the one hand, it's good that we have this good labor market. On the other hand, we've had some more persistent inflation than we might like. But the opportunity cost in this case, the trade-off of less inflation might be fewer people with jobs and fewer people who were there and ready and willing to work, but were being left out of the job market before this.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the fact that the labor market is that tight allowed the opportunity for these people of color or disability to just come in. It gave them the opportunity, like, hey, people that normally would take the job are like, no, I'm not going to take it for $11 an hour. And now it gives them the opportunity, like, cool, I'm going to swoop in and take it, which gives them, opportunities for the future. I also like to think that, like, as much as like we like the economy and the Fed, it's like we also have fiscal policy. We have fiscal policy that can help control inflation, and they're not. So fiscal policy is controlled by Congress, and our Congress is, would rather butt heads like rams than get along and try to do anything else. So, yeah.
All right. This next question I'm going to kind of direct to Courtney because it deals with the role of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the monetary authority for the United States. It has various tools that it uses to try to keep inflation in control. Can you describe some of those tools and then maybe give an assessment of how well they have worked over the last few years?
Yeah, the obvious one is the federal funds rate, or the discount rate that banks pay on reserves that eventually works its way to interest rates that we all pay for different things. So as the cost of borrowing goes up, the idea is that this controls that demand side, the too much cash side. So if you start to tighten monetary policy, higher interest rates, that may reduce, the willingness of consumers to borrow, and then that reduces the amount of money that's out there in the economy. And where we have seen that, we did see almost an immediate effect in the housing market. House prices did start to come down somewhat whenever the federal funds rate started to increase fairly dramatically. We started to see it in the automobile industry as well. But where we've still seen a lot of struggles is in services and goods like food that maybe are not as interest rate sensitive. So I think that tool in particular is probably the main one, the one that most people are familiar with. But we like to say that monetary policy is a blunt instrument, so it can't quite get into the nitty gritty of what everything that affects consumers like fiscal policy can per se. Fiscal policy can be a bit more like a scalpel in some ways. We also have the other two kind of traditional tools that the Fed has is reserve requirements. So these are requirements that the amount of money that banks are required to hold in reserve with the Federal Reserve, so which could potentially be loans that are loaned out. And so that's a way of controlling the money supply as well. And then another one that a lot of people probably follow if you're connected to monetary policy is open market operations. So this is a way, you probably heard of the Fed's balance sheet and how big it got during the last recession, and that was because the Fed was buying a lot of, traditionally these would be, open market operations would have involved treasury securities, so they buy them and then they're able to put that into reserves that banks can use to lend out. So that's a way to control the money supply. But if we're trying to restrict inflation, then the Fed will try to reduce their balance sheet and sell those. And then in the recession, we started using some more kind of extraordinary Federal Reserve tools like quantitative easing, where instead of just buying treasury securities, the Fed bought longer term assets like mortgage-backed securities and things like that. And that helped drive even longer term interest rates down to lower levels. And so those are some of the more common. Of course, if I were to I think I already said I think we've been fairly successful in some of the longer term type goods, but it has been a little more difficult to control inflation in some other areas, particularly like the commodities and the food and things like that are very important to consumers and can unfortunately, I think as was mentioned, have a larger impact on like low and moderate income consumers. So, but I would, if I missed anything or anyone has anything to add.
If anybody else wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to say, like, the Fed's, you have monetary policy, which is run by the Federal Reserve, and it's a very slow process. So if they go out and they buy securities, so think of it going to Bank of America, and they're like, hey, I'm going to buy your treasury bond, and here's a bunch of money, all right? Traditionally, a bank makes the most money off loans. So they're like, hey, I have a whole bunch of excess money. Let's make more loans because I can loan it out for 12% versus, anything else. And so it requires it to trickle through the economy. It's not like fiscal policy. Like, I use my examples. Fiscal policy is like a sledgehammer. So, government spending goes up traditionally in like the stimulus package. And what's easier to spend than $1,400 of free government money? $1,400. And so you go out and you spend. So it's very quick into the economy comparative to like monetary policy that's more of a precise, refined, slower, ease it in. And so it's not as, the timing, the recognition lag of like, did we do the right amount of buybacks? Did we do the right amount of upping or down? It takes a lot longer to see than like, oh, here's $1,400, and then 3 months later they're like, woo, and everybody's going out and buying washing machines and cars and like lockdown in, lockdown ends, and we're all like, let's go, and then we just rush out to, you know, bars and restaurants, and Amazon is like, yay. So it takes longer to play out. So it's, you know, that's about it. Which was, you know, what we're seeing right now. Like the housing market got hit hard with the interest rates. Not only because interest rates are up, because there's a lack of starter homes and affordable housing. Like it's just not, like, I'm sorry for all you young people, but if you're trying to buy a home soon, like, good luck. But in automobiles, you know, big ticket items where you have to take a loan out, those are hit right away. But it's the smaller, like you were saying, the services, the food, you know, maybe, you know, the cow plantation, or not plantation, the cow processing plant might not expand, but that's not going to directly impact ground beef prices right away, maybe 3 years from now. So it takes longer to wiggle out.
All right. So to what extent can inflation contribute to or lead to a recession?
I don't know that we have any evidence that it causes recessions, right?
Yeah.
I think what it does is it feels like a recession.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when prices have gone up, but your income hasn't adjusted to match that, it feels like you took a pay cut.
Yeah.
It's as if you lost your job, or your job suddenly pays 5-10% less. And so it feels tough. And so we actually noticed this summer, is that at that time, gas prices were pretty high, mostly due to the war in Ukraine. And this is at a time when a lot of these firms were increasing their prices all at the same time. And so it felt like there was a lot of economic anxiety, and it felt a lot like a recession. And so you probably saw headlines, are we in a recession? Are we in a recession? Are we in a recession? But none of the economic data supported that we were in a recession. I remember, I'm an economist. I get to do cool things like this and get asked by TV reporters every once in a while some questions. And they asked me, and I was kind of blindsided. They're like, so are we in a recession? I was kind of like, no. Why do you think we're in a recession? And so we had this issue where we kept kicking the can down on the road on this recession. It's like, well, it's not a recession now, but it's about to be.
Yeah.
But still, labor markets have stayed tight. GDP has continued to grow. And now that inflation hopefully is starting to cool, it feels less and less like that.
Well, perceptions about inflation can set in motion things
Sure.
that could lead to
Yeah.
a recession. For example, a government response to a perception of an overheated economy or too high inflation. When that occurs, and we have some of the tools being brought to bear on inflation that were described, of course, if those tools work perhaps more than anticipated or desired, well, then that can definitely lead to a recession where we're kind of oversolving a problem that could be described as a problem more of perception than of anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if inflation gets high and the Fed does have to step in and use the tools that they have, for example, as interest rates increase, especially in an economy where I think we were talking about how we're millennials.
Yes.
And so you can probably calculate my age by this, but I graduated with undergrad in 2009. And that was, when we were, the Fed had, interest rates were at 0. They were for 10 years after that. So most of my adult life out of college has been at extremely low interest rates.
Yep.
And so I think that one thing that, we talk about some in-house, but I don't think is talked a lot about, outside conversations, is just the fact that, we're starting to get to a point where interest rates for a large majority of our population, if you're a young person or a millennial, you've never been in an environment with interest rates above 5%.
Exactly.
And so I think that's one thing from the consumer side that can, maybe drive down demand, limit spending. But then from a business perspective, as the cost of borrowing goes up, companies may decide, not to expand or maybe, things, from from a business cash flow perspective, things get more expensive. Consumers spend less, which translates to lower sales for businesses. That those are the types of things that can set in motion, potentially a recession if, things get so expensive that people stop spending, and then that may translate into, lost profits. And to reduce costs, sometimes one option for companies is to lay people off. So if that gets widespread enough, and on the labor side, if you start to see unemployment rates increase, then that's one component of a recession. But the wheels can just turn in certain ways that. But I think that I would agree that maybe it's not inflation per se, but a combination of higher costs, but also then Fed action that contributes to some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. I think like what the Fed's trying to do is to keep us increasing, but at a decreasing rate.
Yeah.
So that means like our GDP is going up, but just not as fast, and prices not as fast. Like we're not trying to sink us into a recession, as in AKA our GDP be lower this year than it was last year. So GDP is like the total value of our economy. We're not trying to actually like go down. It'd be like the equivalent of me taking a pay cut. I'm not going to try to take a pay cut, but so they're trying to make us grow just at a slower rate. And so that may feel from the perspective like, oh my gosh, we're going into a recession, but really all we're doing is we're running from a 10-minute mile to a 12-minute mile. And so that's why sometimes from the perspective of the consumer, it feels like we're going into a recession. The media does a great job of blowing that up. But in all reality, what the data shows is like, no, we're not. We're just slowing our pace a little bit. That way, in the long term, prices come back to equilibrium or normality. And that way, we're back at our long run output and employment. The labor market goes back to normal. It's just kind of like a resettling that feels disheartening, but it's really not like we're dipping deep into a recession. That's not the goal of the Fed to be like, hey, let's send us into a recession, because that seems like a great idea and a fun time for the millennials that have gone through 2 of them already. So, but yeah, so it's kind of like the media's point is they always try to blow it up to make it sound like recession, like you were saying. It's really like, not really. It's just kind of we're slowing pace. So especially the low income people can get back to normality with their purchasing power, the value of their dollar.
So for my students out here, because of course I was going to bring up the Millennial Distinction, James,
Yes.
it was just going to happen. So for my students out here then, can we assuage them that they are not about to go through a 2007, 2008 in the way that we did?
Oh yeah, no,
Okay.
Not at all. Yeah, you have nothing to worry about like that. That was a unique thing on its own with like the housing, financial. Lehman Brothers was one of the biggest financial companies in the world, and they would just kaput. So that's nothing like that is on the horizon.
Very good.
I want to just follow up, because I remember last year, Dr. Roche, you were talking about this kind of dispute, were we in a recession or not. I know a rule of thumb, in fact, some of our American government textbooks will say, 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth and boom, you had a recessionary period. If I remember right, we hit that, and so there were some people running out saying, see, we told you we're in a recession. And then there were other people saying, kind of like you guys were saying, that, well, all the other economic indicators, if you look at them, don't show that. So let me ask this. How do we know if we're in a recession? And when do we know that we're in a recession?
We know we're in a recession after the fact.
I was just about to say that.
Like that would, I know what that was, and that felt a lot like a recession.
Yeah.
No, so what really happens is we have a group of folks who are at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They're tasked with delineating exactly when a recession starts and when a recession ends. So even the Great Financial Crisis, or Great Recession, took them a couple years to define when exactly we were in a recession. So I could be eating my hat. It could be the case that a year from now they came back and said, hey, you remember that month in June? That was a recession. You were super wrong. That might happen. But again, it's always after the fact. And we look at a lot of different indicators, because 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, that was the old rule of thumb. But we
Yep.
were just hearing that, well, that was actually a good thing, that we were trying to cool down the economy. We were boiling the water, now we're back at a simmer. And so that might have been a good sign. And what's been said is it's a soft landing is what we're achieving.
Yeah.
Is that we have a plane, it's going to come down. We would rather it not be a crash. We would like to just land softly and nicely, not one of those like I'm landing at the DFW airport and I bounced a little bit. So that's what we're going for. But we'll know soon, hopefully.
Yeah, because I also believe that after those two consecutive, we also had the next month was positive.
Yeah.
So it's like even if it was a recession, it was a recession for 2 months, went right back into an expansionary period, which is where we're at right now.
Good. All right. What are we've talked about the monetary policies a little bit and how they attempt to kind of deal with some of these problems. What are the fiscal policies that are in place to try to address if we are in a recession? And maybe we should start with, I know in public policy arenas we talk about discretionary fiscal policy and non-discretionary fiscal policy. So if somebody wants to tackle explaining the difference between those two, and then maybe what are the different tools within those body of policies that we try to use.
Oh, well, discretionary would be items that go through the normal budget and appropriations process that are not on automatic pilot. Interest on the debt is non-discretionary. It doesn't have to fight a budget battle every session. So when you talk about the non-discretionary part, a piece of the pie, that's by far the bigger piece of the pie, and the smaller piece is the discretionary. And when you talk about tax cuts or tax increases, of course, we never talk about tax increases. We talk about tax cuts, whether or not to do tax cuts, and when we're going to do tax cuts, how much should we cut? And so, tax cuts are unlikely during a recession or when a recession is threatened. Tax cuts are also likely in times of inflation and growth. Tax increases is what I meant. Tax increases are very unlikely no matter what the situation. Tax cuts are very likely no matter what the situation. So I think it's a little bit of an overstatement to say that fiscal policy is a powerful mover and shaker of inflation or recession, because we simply don't use tax increases, which is one tool, and we tend to use tax cuts whenever we can get away with them, regardless of what tool might be needed. So fiscal policy as a tool is may not be a blunt instrument, or it may be a blunt instrument, but there's one tool in the toolbox we are very reluctant to use, regardless, and then there's the other tool in the toolbox that we'll use willy-nilly regardless.
Yeah, so you can think of Uncle Sam. He's got a tool belt. On one side he's got monetary, and the other side he's got fiscal policy. And so fiscal policy is run by Congress, and you have expansionary and contractionary, and the names kind of give them away. Expansionary is when they're trying to expand the economy, and contractionary is when they're supposed to be slowing it down, like they should be doing right now. But Congress, to stay in Congress, you have to get elected. And so what looks good on a bumper sticker is I cut taxes and I gave your grandmother more Social Security, not vote for me. We were in a boom and I raised taxes and took away, government spending. That's not going to get you reelected. And so that's part of the reason why we have this national debt that grows, is because they're more likely to be yes, let's spend more. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act came out to fight inflation, and it actually helped, spend more money in the economy. So it was kind of contradictory. Or the Infrastructure Act that we just passed. Not saying we didn't need it. Not saying that at all. I think we definitely did need the Infrastructure Act, well overdue. But, it didn't help curve inflation, because it's spending more money. It's putting people to work, which is great. You know what I mean? I'm not fighting against any of that. But, if you're looking at the theoretical, traditional, what we should be doing is we should be spending less right now. We should be raising taxes. In combination with what the Fed's doing is raising interest rates. If they worked in combination, we would probably get out of this inflationary period faster, maybe a softer landing. But once again, fiscal policy is run by Congress, which is, highly like rams butting heads right now. So especially during an election year coming up. So no one's going to do a lot.
Yeah. Can I add one thing? Because on the, I think that some of the recent events in the banking sector have also created some concerns about recession. You probably have all heard about Silicon Valley Bank and some of the issues there. So I just wanted to add, because I didn't cover this earlier, that the Fed also has some tools to help when financial stability is a concern, because financial instability is another thing that can potentially lead to a recession. And so one of the primary tools that the Federal Reserve used in this situation, when there was concern about banks and particularly deposits at those banks, because whether or not deposits are safe, whether or not banks have enough money to lend, the Fed has what's called the discount window, where banks can come and lend. So the Federal Reserve, if a bank is in trouble, the Federal Reserve becomes the lender of last resort for that bank. So the bank can come to the discount window and borrow money from the Fed at a low rate, and then lend that out to customers at a higher rate. And so then the margin on that is the money that the bank is able to make, typical of how credit and lending works. So that's one of the tools that the Fed has. Another one that's less known and a newer one is called, and this one is, I think, very complicated and kind of weird, but from an ag economist perspective, it's called the overnight reverse repo. And that's where a bank can borrow money from the Fed and then sell it back to the Fed the next day at a higher rate. And then so the money that they make off of that, then they can use as reserves or as loans to spend. So I just wanted to mention those, because from a banking perspective too, the Fed does have tools that it uses, and that also contributes to financial stability and then kind of a stable economy as well.
I'm glad you brought SVB up. We're kind of remiss we didn't have a question about that actually within this debate. Is everything going to right itself in Silicon Valley? I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, but you brought it up. You brought it up, sister.
Yeah, I didn't bring it up. I think that it does seem that things have calmed down, and that I know, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, which is who Sarah and I work for, we cover a 7-state region in the middle of the country.
So
and
that's
we
not
also,
you.
Yeah.
but I will say so I just wanted to mention that, because I do know from working with our bank examiners in our district that our banking system here in Oklahoma and in our region is very stable. And I think for the country as a whole, I think there were some issues, some very specific and kind of unique issues with Silicon Valley Bank and some of the others where we saw problems, but I do think that most banks coming out of the last Great Recession are very well capitalized, very strong, and I think that things seem to have settled down.
Do banks need any more regulation?
Ah.
I'm sorry, I'm really not trying to get the Federal Reserve fired. I'm just curious.
I don't know that they do. Okay. I think that this was a very specific case. But I think we'll know a lot more on May 1st. Because that's whenever, May 1st is when the investigation from Vice Chair Barr at the Federal Reserve did do an investigation of what happened, because Silicon Valley Bank was under the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco's. They were in their book. I mean, the San Francisco Fed was their regulator. And so because of that, our vice chair and board of governors did an investigation. That investigation will be made public on May 1st. So, if you're interested, be looking for that.
Stay
I would
tuned.
have more.
Yes, absolutely.
If that was already published.
No, fabulous. All right, so last question before we open it up to you guys. I'm sure you probably have a couple of questions for our panelists. You've kind of already answered this, but do you foresee a significant recession in the next 12 to 24 months? And that could be at a national level or a global one, as I mentioned. That would be of interest to me. Why or why not?
I would just start by saying, 12 to 24 months, I would kind of say who knows, but,
Sure.
talking through the next 5 years or so, it seems to me that the pressures are there to worry about a recession. And this is, here I'm going to tell you how old I am without telling you. Most of my adult life, we've had low interest rates and stagnant wages. And what's happening now is different, okay? We're seeing high interest rates and wages are starting to move. And the pressures at the federal government level are to start worrying when things like that happen. So what I see are pressures on policymakers, both at the Fed and to the extent that it matters in Congress, to do something to get us back to what it has been like my whole adult life: low interest rates and stagnant wages. I feel that there are pressures to do something to get us back to that, as if that is some sort of desired equilibrium. So if you would like to worry about a recession, you have some company. I'm a little bit worried too.
I would say
It depends.
it depends.
Okay.
The traditional.
Just making sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely the
All right.
traditional economists. That's a long time frame.
Sure.
None of us saw the war in Ukraine coming, and that shocked
Oh,
the
I
world
did.
economy.
I did, but I'm an international lady.
Oh, okay, well,
Moving on.
yeah.
It's okay. I did.
So
We did.
I was more worried about education and
Oh,
housing,
it's
but it's okay. But yeah, so there's a lot that could go on. If we're, ceteris paribus, if everything keeps going the way it is right now, then no, not at all. I foresee things slowly getting back to equilibrium, which is a nerdy way of saying back to normal, with what's going on in our current economy, politics. I also see that we have an election season coming up, so I don't foresee any big thing on the political level that's going to alter us into a recession or into anything else. I just think we're all kind of still getting used to post-pandemic work life. Are we going back to the office? Are we not going back to the office? Education, a lot of schools are still doing Zoom classes or offering that option. And so this is still kind of the ripple effects that was the pandemic, kind of resettling work life, school life, home life, work with your children, working from home, teaching from home, stuff like that. So I think it's just kind of got to let the ripples through the pond play out. And not unless someone does a cannonball in, another war or something. So.
Okay, Taiwan.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, dude.
That's on
Don't.
the risk, yeah.
Please. Anybody else? Recession?
I think for me, I think like Dr. Roche said, there's so many different indicators that can determine whether or not we're in a recession. And so thinking about some of those indicators, personal income has been really strong. It's really been GDP that's been kind of the only, the main concern, because it did dip and then came back up. Employment growth is stronger than it was prior to the pandemic still, and we still have really tight labor markets. So to me, it's hard to, on the labor market side, it's hard to see us going from 2 vacancies for every unemployed worker to an environment where unemployment is a big concern, because we're also at very low unemployment rates. But I would agree that you just never know what could happen. I think that China and Taiwan is something to watch that could be a global
Absolutely.
shock. I know I read The Economist magazine, if anyone, and they have been zoomed in on China and U.S. relations the last few issues. I think that that's a significant risk, because they are a major trading partner with us. We've already seen a bit of recession in Europe because of issues with Russia, Ukraine. So I think there are certainly some risks out there. Unfortunately, I'm not a forecaster, so it is hard for me to say, but I think that there are some risks on the horizon in the next 12 to 24 months.
Okay.
All right.
Do you have any burning questions while you have this dream panel?
I don't.
Okay.
I do want to take a moment while people are maybe thinking about what questions they might want to ask. and give Dr. Roche an opportunity to talk about Economics by the Pint, which is a wonderful event
Yes.
that if you ever get the opportunity to attend, you should. I've been to a couple. Dr. Roche has made some presentations there. They have been fantastic, quite entertaining. And so if you'd like to talk about that a little bit and just kind of give it a plug.
I would love to have a commercial for all of you right now, especially those of you who are maybe above 21.
Yes.
Now, everyone's invited, always, especially students. But it's more enjoyable if you happen to be above the age of 21. So I have coupled with the Oklahoma Council on Economic Education, and we host, it's basically a fundraising event so that we can help with personal financial literacy at the schools. We're doing a lot of great stuff with training teachers and helping learn about that. So it's a fundraiser for them, but really it's a fun time to talk about economics, have a few beers at Coop Ale Works, and enjoy yourself. So if you're interested in this type of thing, which you're either here for class or you're interested in, so hopefully you're here because you're interested, I think you would really enjoy Econ by the Pint. I'll let Dr. Davenport know next time it's coming up. It normally is in the fall, normally in October. Something about Oktoberfest and beer and economics, it all just makes perfect sense to me. So if you would like to come, we would love to have you.
I used to be part of those.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right.
Brent Ribby.
Do we want to open it up
Yeah.
for questions?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
did our masters together.
Ah,
Oh,
cool.
Yeah.
Gabe, we'll start.
Okay, so this last, ever since the war in Ukraine, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on Russia as far as, our deals and stuff that we made with them. And this last week, President Putin has met with
Xi Jinping.
the President of China. I can't pronounce
Xi
it.
Jinping.
Is that shaking out? But so and as they've done that, some of the things that they met about, I was not able to find everything that they met about, but I know that a lot of that was to circumvent a lot of the issues that our sanctions imposed on Russia's economy, especially in the oil trade. What is that going to look like for the U.S. and the rest of the world as far as the oil trade industry goes?
Well, I know Xi Jinping also met with France yesterday, correct? Yeah, and I think France was saying like you cannot do a lot of stuff with Russia, trying to get them right on the EU side and the American side. So kind of like right now it's kind of up in the air. Like China's kind of like the wild card, like on bingo, you're going to play the draw too or not, So it's kind of what are they going to do? So it's really up in the air right now of whatever China decides.
I think it would be prudent to speed up our energy transition to fewer fossil fuel uses. Global warming aside, that would be the added cherry on top benefit that we reduce that likelihood or the worst case outcomes there. But also as a hedge against outside interests, outside geopolitical risks, that is a better alternative. We have battery technology that is light years beyond what it was just 2 to 5 years ago. That couples well with renewable growth, and then you couple that with natural gas, you can kind of fill in the gaps there. We become a little bit more economically independent. And so we've seen in Europe through this like concern over spiking prices, they had a warmer winter than they expected, which again, global warming, but they sped up their transition, they reduced their consumption, and they electrified a lot of utilities, their own household heating now comes through heat pumps, which are better technology than they were before. Their cooktops are now coming through induction stoves, which are a little bit better than they were before. And so we're starting to see a transition in just consumer behavior, which will help alleviate some of these geopolitical concerns.
Yeah. They also are building more natural gas ports to get natural gas from the United States and be less reliant on Russia. So that was like the first big thing they did, which that takes time to build, but in the long run, it allows the EU to be less reliant on Russia and more on us because we have better relations, better norms and values and stuff like that. So.
Other questions?
John had one in the back. I want to.
Yeah.
So lower income, would we agree that maybe like $30,000 and less is lower income? Maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How do we think that stagnation in income is going to change for those people? Minimum wage hasn't changed relatively at all in a decade or more. How do we help those people more in an economy where eggs cost $10?
Well, I would say like the minimum wage debate right now is kind of mute.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go anywhere in Norman or Oklahoma City and you can get $11, $12, $13 an hour. And so, there's, around campus corner at OU, they're offering between $12 and $18 an hour for waiters and waitresses. So like the minimum wage still being at 7 and some change, doesn't matter because the market value right now, the value of like a minimum wage worker is well above the actual minimum wage. So it's more like, the wages are going up because of the tight labor market and prices are also going up. So if we didn't have the inflation, but we had the minimum wage jump, the wage labor jump, they would be doing really well right now, making $14 an hour, at pre-pandemic prices, they'd be, their purchasing power would be way higher. So it's a combination of we're seeing like a tight labor market and higher, equilibrium wages plus increases in foods and services. So kind of offset each other a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think if you look at a breakdown of like different wage categories, the lowest wage workers saw the strongest wage growth kind of in the last couple years, and then it steps down so the highest wage workers had the lowest wage growth. Everyone's wages grew, but we saw the strongest wage growth. And then I also work with a macroeconomist at the Kansas City Fed who did some work in analyzing wage growth among job switchers. So the workers that had the absolute strongest wage growth were low wage workers that actually switched industries. So if you switch industries, you saw the strongest wage growth. If you switch jobs within the same industry, you had stronger wage growth. And those that had the lowest wage growth were actually those that kept the loyal people that stayed in their same jobs, like me. So I think that was interesting. Now, what do we do about it? I think that's why the Fed has been so focused on trying to get inflation under control, because when we have inflation under control, that helps all wage categories. I think we've also seen a lot of data on on savings rates and excess savings, and that got huge after following all the kind of government stimulus. But most of that savings now is in the highest income brackets. So we've already seen, because of high inflation, most of the lower and middle income households have worked through most of their savings that they may have built up. So I think it's, just from my perspective, it's really just getting inflation under control.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
How are those metrics gathered?
Oh, yeah. I mean, different. So you're talking about wages and things like that. So different government sources. The main ones that we use are the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's a lot of quarterly surveys of either households, like the Current Population Survey is a household survey that asks about wages and income and employment. And then there's the Establishment Survey that actually surveys businesses and asks questions and collects information on employment levels and things like that. So that's where we get. I don't know if others use different labor or wage or, and then we also use data aggregation services. We pull a lot of our data from a service called Haver, that pulls data from a lot of different sources and then has it on one platform. So, but all publicly available. So.
Who's next? Oh, yes.
I had a question that kind of went with his, like you had said with the wages and whatnot, there's not really much of a big need to increase them because nowadays you can find jobs that are anywhere from 10 upwards of $50, $70. Is there a specific reason why they won't increase minimum wage? For the past decade, it's been stuck at $7.25. A decade ago, back when I was early adult, it was normal to work 4+ Like, is there a specific reason why they haven't decided to increase that yet? Like, I know it varies from state to state, but is there a specific reason why they just
Well,
turn it off?
I think the quickest, shortest, best answer is money in politics. The influence of the way we finance our campaigns. If you want the visual of minimum wage going down to defeat, you would think about Senator Kirsten Sinema curtsying and giving the thumbs down on the floor of the Senate. And she's sort of a poster child for a special interest influence. So the short answer is the way we do politics in this country and the influence of special interest because of how we finance campaigns.
Wholly agree. And then I'll add to that we're only now policy's only now catching up to empirical evidence. So the classic traditional economics textbook example of increasing the minimum wage is that you have this price floor and you're going to cause unemployment. And there have been enough state-to-state minimum wage law changes that hasn't come out in the evidence, that hasn't come out in the data. What we see is that there's a lot of concentration in the firms that offer these lowest wage jobs, and they're able to have, it's called monopsony power. They're able to keep wages lower than they might be in a more competitive labor market. So, as we learn more about the actual effects of increasing the minimum wage, we've learned that it doesn't cause the big unemployment concern that we might have had in the past. I got to be on a panel similar to this. I was with the State Commissioner on Labor, Leslie Osborne, and she cited the exact same research I was going to. So this is getting out into the ether. This is getting out to both sides of the aisle. She came in and said, yes, the evidence supports raising the minimum wage because it doesn't cause the economic distress we might have been afraid of. But whether or not she would run on increasing the minimum wage, I don't think she'd go that far. She may admit that it would be a good idea, but I don't think she'd make it a policy platform.
Well, as like a small follow-up question, to like ever see it growing? Because I know each state is different in the sense of minimum wage. What I've been taught is more like when inflation goes up, then wage can increase at times. Like I said, it depends on the state. Because I know in Washington State, I think their minimum wage is like about double at least what ours is, and I know like other factors kind of mitigate with that, kind of like Oklahoma being like housing is a mess right now, but Oklahoma is still one of like the cheapest states housing wise to get property in compared to like California, for example, that's crazy. Like, do you think they'll ever raise minimum wage in Oklahoma, or is that just something that's not a concern at all?
Probably not, and in part because right now the economic argument is that you see your average 7-Eleven or CVS offering $12, $13, $14 an hour, which at my university is essentially what we pay adjunct professors. In which we get some wage compression in that way.
Yeah.
And so,
I just want to ask this. The extent or the impact of raising the minimum wage on labor unemployment obviously depends on the extent to which it's raised, right? I mean, there is a point at which you would see a greater impact.
Sure,
on that.
absolutely. Yeah, we haven't yet, or at least empirically, we haven't met that yet. We haven't gotten to the point where it causes more job loss than wage gains.
Sarah, I have to get you. Did you still have the question?
I don't want to.
Nope. Go ahead. Or, sir, I'm sorry. You had, go ahead.
Being in a different age group than
Please.
most of the students here, my interest is less on things like minimum wage
Sure.
and mortgage rates and cost of eggs, and more on, when is my NASDAQ heavy portfolio going to be back to pre-pandemic growth?
Man, I wish I had that.
And I can feel comfortable again. And I hope it's relevant to inflation, but I sure feel the pinch.
Sure. Is that a question?
Yeah, if I could pull out a crystal ball and tell you, because that's generally, this is like the most common question I get when I tell people I'm an economist, and they're like, well, how's the stock market going to do? And I'm like, well, hold on, let me get my 8 ball and, let you know what Wall Street thinks. Just because, stock market is such a small segment of economics. But, I think this Wall Street is still coming into equilibrium, which again is a nerdy way of saying that the ripples are still settling post-pandemic, especially with a lot of the tech sector that's been up in the air lately. A lot of tech sector jobs have been they allow them to work from home. So then we have that reshuffle. For the first time in a long ever, I think California saw from census to census, they saw a decline in population. And the two places they were going, top two places they're going were Oklahoma and Texas, because they can work from home, lower cost of living, same thing, And so I think there's a lot of reshuffling that's going around, and then you still got the war in Ukraine. So Wall Street is all about expectations. It's how can they forecast? And so right now they're having to forecast post-pandemic, the Fed and the interest rates and what they're doing, war in Ukraine. And so when they're uncertain, they're less likely to make big moves. So I think it's just going to have to pan out. I know they just had actually a good week, I believe. Yeah.
I buy index funds. So
Yeah, I'd say I'm all about the index
What's the
fund.
stock market doing? I don't know.
I don't know.
Other questions?
Millennials and Gen Z have expressed an interest in limiting consumption and spending as a means of being more sustainable. Yet we are also told that the economy depends on spending and
Yeah,
consumption.
70%.
So how will these conflicting points of view reconcile in the interest of a healthy economy?
I hope it results in a market opportunity for entering businesses to produce their products in a more ethical and sustainable way. I think we're seeing growth in non-plastic goods. Like you can get deodorant that comes in a paper carton, and that's still a new product, that's still new spending, but it's a way that takes account of the actual externality effect of some of the goods that we purchase. When we have a bottle of water on our table, we're not thinking about the plastic bottle lasts forever, and I'm heartened to see Gen Z and younger groups take that into their purchasing decision. Normally, you would hope economic policy would come in and find the exact right price for that externality effect. If I'm a business thinking about my next great idea, I might see this consumer sentiment and try and target that. And so what you probably will see is companies pivot to try and sell to this different customer base.
And I think it's a really great question because a lot of economic theory rests upon assumptions about human nature. And these assumptions have been relatively constant for quite some time. And if your question is getting at the idea that maybe we're on the brink of an era where assumptions about human nature need to be rethought, I just think that's why it's a really great question.
Yeah, I like to think that this is a great example of, economics in the free market. I mean, you have Rent the Runway, you have all these, Plato's Closet to repurpose clothes. You have a lot of new companies that are pivoting. Water bottles are starting to be made of plant products, 30%. So as we see millennials and Gen Zs that are like, hey, we want more sustainable, we want more of this, it's going to be the opportunity for companies to either pivot and go, or they're going to die out, because they are the future, those two generations. And, evidence of the rise in these things right here, everyone has one now. If you went back 10 years, no one had something like this. No college campus, I find 5 of them every time I leave class when I teach at OU. So, and I'm all like, these are expensive. But it's the rise of that, it goes back to the invisible hand, Adam Smith, you have to follow what's going on or go off to the pasture and die. So,
do we sometimes not value that process enough? In other words, companies are going to produce what people want.
Yeah, it's
and
called.
They're going to spend their time trying to figure that out.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And we also don't take into account innovation that occurs on a regular basis to address some of these issues.
Yeah. We call it the your dollar votes. So companies will make what people want to buy. That's why Apple's making more tablets and cell phones versus computers, because that's what's selling. And so if they're a smart business, they're going to shift labor and production to what's selling, what the dollar votes, versus what's not. And if they don't, they just, so yeah.
And it may take some short-term spending for longer-term sustainability in some ways. I mean, I would agree with what you said about the Inflation Reduction Act, because there's a lot of spending in that, but some of the spending could ultimately drive down, consumption of non-renewable goods. For example, there's a lot of energy legislation in there to promote renewable energy, for example. And so we know that like oil and gasoline are very volatile commodities that contribute a great deal to, can contribute a great deal to inflation, inflationary pressure. So in the longer term, if we have, if there is some sort of energy transition, one of the nice things about renewables is that they're a little more, they could be a little more stable and not so subject to, global shocks and conditions. So that's one example of it. Might take some short-term spending to maybe get to longer-term goals that that these generations may have.
Dr. Farmer, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I want to think about this in a global context. When we talk about fiscal policy or monetary policy, we tend to sort of think like the United States economy as a closed system, and we can manipulate some things within it. But how does that fit into the larger world economy? So sometimes when there's inflation, people say, well, but there's inflation in Europe and ours isn't as bad as theirs. Or if there's recession, there's unemployment in Europe, and ours isn't as bad as theirs. So how much is there sort of a contagion effect, or how much are we so interlinked that we don't really have control of it? That's my real question. How much of it is so interlinked that we
I'm about to hear the word
don't have
globalization or not.
Yeah, I just think you make a really good point. The question is how interlinked are we? I think there's no way to argue that we aren't. We don't drive the car so much anymore. We're all kind of passengers in a car. The U.S. and other nations. I just think it's a really great observation.
Yeah, the old saying is if the U.S. catches a cold, the southern hemisphere catches the flu. We tend to transmit any issue we have. I don't know how reciprocal that always is, but you're right. I think it spreads, and we do depend on each other. And supply chains, you can get a package of fruit that has gone across the ocean 2 to 3 times and get sold to you for $2. We're interlinked.
Yeah. Sure. Mr. Haney.
Yeah, this goes back to the first question that Professor Davenport asked, but it was hinted at that we have targeted inflation currently, which is for me very irritating. That the Fed's policy is essentially that if I have $100 in my account January 1, the Fed wants it to be worth $97, $98 come December 31st, but that deflation is bad. So there's this deflation phobia amongst mainstream economists. And I'm about to write a paper on why I think that's wrong, and so I'm wondering, A, why do you think deflation is bad, and is it possible that sort of the Great Depression is coloring that, but that the Great Depression is an outlier?
Well, it's all about whether you're a creditor or a debtor, right? If you lend money, inflation hurts. If you borrow money, all else being equal, inflation helps. It just depends on whether you're a debtor or a creditor as to how you feel about deflation. I've had student loans for decades. I can tell you what, Brazilian-style inflation would help me pay my student loans.
So it might help you pay off your student loans, but it's not going to help with buying consumer goods.
Well, but if everything rises, if prices rise and wages rise, my student loans are fixed. You buy a house at $100,000, inflation goes crazy, prices go up, wages go up. My house looks really, really cheap compared to what I thought I was paying for it back when I bought it. So, if I'm a lender, on the other hand, inflation is the worst thing that can happen to me. If I lend you money at 5% and inflation is 10%, I'm losing money. Why did I even lend you anything? It just depends on whether you're a debtor or a creditor.
I think also, so that's tied with the assumption that GDP growth is also having at about a 2 to 3% clip, and so that everything's moving along. It's a sign of average growth. The Fed wouldn't be targeting 2% and 0% GDP growth. So they're targeting a healthy economy that money keeps flowing around and circulating and churning, and that's an indicator that it's not too fast, not too slow. They've kind of picked it as a Goldilocks. With the also kind of the add-on assumption that 2%, say you don't get a raise this year, but maybe you do next year, 2% isn't going to drastically change your lifestyle. Now, if it's 2%, then 2%, then 2%, then 2%, then yes, that starts to change your lifestyle. But they believe that this is a small indicator inflation rate that most people can stomach a year or two without having income adjustments.
And now actually the target is an average rate
Yeah.
of 2%. So theoretically, you could have, if we're running at a clip of 7% inflation and we're targeting an average of 2%, theoretically you could have much lower disinflation to get at that target average rate. So I'd be interested to read your paper.
Can I ask one other economic modeling question?
No. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
So I've been thinking about this for a year and a half. I'm a political scientist, not an economist. I've been thinking about this for a year and a half or 2 years. And now I have the perfect people to ask the question. You said,
There you go.
ask your question.
Yep.
It seems to me that pre-pandemic, we had economic models and we all sort of understood and things worked more or less. Then the pandemic created a shock that appears in the data to be a decline or a recession, but really it was a shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
And then following that, you have what appears to be very rapid growth.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, it was just opening up.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some period of time where we kind of get back to pre-pandemic levels or something like that. So I guess my question is, at what point do the economic models that we believed in pre-pandemic really start to show us the economy again, as opposed to just these kind of weird anomalies that occurred?
Huh. So I guess you're asking like the pandemic as a shock, and then the growth we had wasn't really growth. It was just getting back to normality.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of like the economics of a disaster. So Katrina hits New Orleans. Short term, boom, hard hit, bad. Rebuilding, GDP growth, local, state, because we're spending, we're growing. So I always pose a question like, are disasters good? Are pandemics good? Because you do see post like a boom. And the answer is, most students are like, yes, it's great. GDP went up. We had people working. And I'm like, yeah, but the opportunity cost of spending all that money towards vaccines and masks and additional unemployment insurance could have spent with education spending. So it's the, Katrina, yeah, they had a short-term boom because they rebuilt and people got the jobs. So that's money that we could have spent elsewhere. So you're not really like, it is a boom in the data, but economically you could also say like, well, that's money that we spent that we could have done scholarships or infrastructure or public employee raises and stuff like that. So
I have a quick response and then I have to jump out and go teach a test. I have to, my poor principals and micro students. Lucas critique is involved here too. So we may return to what is normal, but the shock of this pandemic has forced us into a new reality where like Zoom exists.
Yep.
Zoom
Yep.
existed before the pandemic, but now we realize, it's actually not as bad as I thought it might be.
what?
Yeah.
Oh,
And so,
Unless you're having to teach live.
right, yeah, no, that's pretty rough. But like a preference for work from home, I that's a new preference that I think is sticky.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of new things now that the pandemic, like what was probably inevitable is now like accelerated.
Yeah.
So
All right, I think that needs to be our last question.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank our panel.
thank you.
We will be in touch very soon. Professor Davenport and I will be planning a fabulous Constitution Week eventually for later in the fall. So stay tuned for more political science stuff. Again, thank you for being here today, our fabulous panelists. Have a wonderful day.
Nah.